The building was a large two-story brick that had been an extensive country home for a rich family in its past. It was located on the near north side of downtown St. Louis in an area that had long since declined to a shadow of its former splendor. The area was being revitalized into an upper-class business section of the city. The stately old house now held 4 offices on the first floor and 2 large apartments on the second. As you entered the 10-feet-tall double doors into the foyer of the building, a wide hallway extended to the rear of the building. There was a large door at the rear with a red-lit exit sign over it. Along that gateway into the building were 4 offices, 2 on either side of the hallway. The first office on the left had a heavy wooden door with a frosted glass panel in the center, which had a month-old sign painted in gold letters with a black border. Matthew Steele, Investigations, Security Specialist. That's me, Matt Steele, famous, or maybe it's infamous, private investigator. I fight for truth, justice, and the American way. Actually, I am just trying to make a living. Well, I didn't really have to work thanks to a settlement from the city of St. Louis, but I get bored just sitting around. I was a detective first class with the St. Louis police when I found my wife, Johanna, and my boss, Captain Joe Harper, in bed together. I kicked Harper's butt and threw my wife out of the house. I wouldn't have beat on the slime ball except he went for his service revolver because he thought I was going to beat on him. I ended up divorced and was fired for insubordination and assault on Harper. The St. Louis Police Department didn't want the negative publicity when I threatened a suit for wrongful termination and settled for a large sum out of court. I was no longer a cop, but I needed to do something, so I became a private detective. Nice digs, I said as I leaned back in my new desk chair and put my feet up on my brand new desk. This was the first day in my new office, although I'd been living in one of the upstairs apartments for almost 5 months. I still owned a house, having gotten it from my divorce, but I rented it out. Looking out the big bay window facing the walkway up to the building and the street, I watched as businessmen and women passed by on the sidewalk. Had to admit they were a more successful class of people than I'd watched from my old office. It was a warm spring day, so the women were made up and dressed better than near my previous office building, each trying to outdo the others. The ladies mostly wore sexy business suits with skirts above the knee and high heels as they strutted by my window. I hadn't wanted to move from my old office, but that part of downtown had turned into an area that even I would hesitate going into after dark. How the mighty had fallen. At the urging of my girlfriend and others, I decided to change my business venue. Of course, the fact that the building that housed my old office had been condemned made the decision much easier. 2 weeks after I and the rest of the tenants moved out, the city demolished the building as a safety precaution. They said they were afraid that if someone sneezed, the building would fall down around them. I like the scenery better, Matt continued. And at least I can leave for home late at night and not worry about getting mugged. He smiled and added, Abby likes the place better too. My friend and former commander at the St. Louis Police Department, Major Taylor, told me I needed a better office to attract a better class of clients. If you work out of the slums, then that's the type of business you'll get, Taylor suggested. Get yourself a better workplace. I had been Detective First Class Matt Steele with the St. Louis Police until I beat the hell out of my boss who had me fired. After receiving the large lawsuit settlement from the city for wrongful termination, I decided to open my own detective agency. Now I owned, operated, and was the sole employee of a private investigations business. Due to the settlement, I could afford to take only the cases or jobs that I wanted. Got to admit, Abby and the Major were right. I continued talking to the new office. This is a better deal and I can go upstairs and be home in no time after closing my office. Yep, smooth move, Mr. Steele. A silhouette appeared through the frosted glass of the door. Then I heard 2 sharp knocks and my door opened before I could say, "Come in." A large, well-dressed and groomed man stepped into the office. "Mr. Steele?" The man asked, and when I nodded, he said, "I am Jonathan Caldwell Robinson. I know who you are, Mr. Robinson. I recognize you from your pictures in the paper and on TV." Jonathan Robinson was a well-known, almost famous, business owner. He was a patron of the arts and on several philanthropic committees for the benefit of St. Louis. I had heard gossip that his actions were more for his benefit than the city's. It was a good excuse for rubbing elbows with the movers and shakers in St. Louis and the state. Looks like the stereotype of the successful, social climbing, and politically connected inner circle of the city, I thought. Robinson was about 6'3", the same as Matt, but the resemblance stops there. Where Matt had black hair and gray eyes, Robinson had blonde hair so light it was almost white, but with a smattering of gray at the temples, and his eyes were a piercing blue. Matt had a large frame and weighed around 225. I knew from his media profile that the man was 46, 10 years older than me. Robinson was slender, about 180 pounds, and dressed in a very expensive manner. His bearing was of entitlement, as if everyone should jump when he spoke. Damn suit cost more than my whole wardrobe, I thought as I returned the stare from Robinson. Don't think I like him, and I haven't even talked to him. What can I do for you, John? That's Mr. Robinson, if you please, Robinson replied with a condescending manner. I'd like to hire your services. He waited for me to take my feet down from the desk and show eagerness to do his bidding. Now I know I don't like the man. Maybe I should jump up and snap to attention. Instead, I didn't move other than to wave a hand for Robinson to continue. I have suspicions that my wife, Cynthia, is having an affair. I'd like you to follow her and get evidence that I can use in a divorce. You're a rich man, Mr. Robinson, I said the name with sarcasm. With the divorce laws being what they are, it might be cheaper to keep her. You would normally be correct. However, I can't have my wife being a common 304. In my position, it doesn't look good. Robinson sat down in the chair in front of Matt's desk. He shot the cuffs of his white silk shirt, straightened his tie, and smoothed the crease of his pant leg. He continued in his oh-so-very cultured voice. In addition, we do have a prenuptial agreement, and if I can prove infidelity, she'll have to leave with just the clothes on her back. I would be very appreciative if you can get the evidence I need. Then I intend to file for a divorce citing adultery as the reason. I hadn't liked Robinson's political leanings as reported in the media, and I didn't like the man anymore in person. There's no need to run around in jeans and a golf shirt, like me, I thought. But that suit looks like it cost $3,000 or $4,000, and that's just plain showing off. Don't like the phony way he talks either. I am sorry, Mr. Robinson, I don't do domestic cases. It was obvious that Robinson wasn't used to people refusing his requests. You will be well compensated. Can't help you, Mr. Robinson, Matt replied again, saying the name with sarcasm. Don't you need the money? Robinson said, looking around the office with hardly disguised contempt. Not yours, Robinson. I suggest you leave now. Our talk is over. The look of surprise on the man's face made me chuckle, but I stopped laughing at Robinson's next statement. I'll give you $10,000 to follow and obtain evidence that my wife is having an affair. I looked at Robinson for several seconds. Why so much? There are other PIs that will work for a lot less. Jason Worth and Hunter Blaine both sing your praises. I raised an eyebrow. It had the effect I wanted as he continued. I've done my due diligence and have been told that you and a man named Chambers are the best in town, and I usually get the best. Robinson added. Yeah, but Raleigh isn't near as good looking as me. I looked out my window as the business crowd walked past my window and thought about the two previous clients that Robinson mentioned. Domestic cases were ones I usually avoided, and the settlement I'd gotten from the police department made sure I didn't have to take them. But then again, $10,000 was a hell of a fee for a few days' work. Okay, I'll help you, but I'll only give it 2 weeks. If I can't get the goods on Mrs. Robinson, or she isn't cheating, I still get half the fee, payable in advance. Robinson reached into his jacket pocket, took out his checkbook, wrote a check for $5,000, and slid it across the desk to me. I am sure you'll be able to help me. I'll need information on your wife, her schedule, where she hangs out, and her friends. I also need a recent picture, I told him. Robinson slid a large manila envelope across the desk. There is Cynthia's picture, her license plate number and type of car she drives, a list of the charities and committees she's involved with, and a list of her friends. When can you start? I just did. I'll keep you posted. I'll expect daily progress reports, Mr. Steele. You'll get what I find when I find it. At the look on Robinson's face, Matt held out the check and added, That's the way I work. You can always find yourself another boy. Why are you being so confrontational, Mr. Steele? Matt stared at Robinson and then answered, I don't like doing what we call domestic work. It seldom turns out well. I've taken the job and your money, and I'll do my best, but it has to be on my terms. Very well. Robinson pointed to the envelope. My card with my private number is there also. Please let me know when you find something. He stood, shot his cuffs again, and turned and walked out of the office. Pompous but, I thought as I watched him leave. But a rich pompous but, I muttered, and I put the check in my pocket. How was your first day in your new office? Abby asked as she breezed in from work at 4 o'clock. Abigail Stewart is my, live-in girlfriend, I guess you'd call her. Abby is about 5'8", with an athletic body, but there was no doubt that she is all women. Her hair is strawberry blonde and cut in a pixie style that makes her green eyes and full lips stand out. She has a smattering of freckles across her nose. As I looked up at her and dropped my feet from my desk to the floor, I was once again surprised and grateful for our relationship, considering my distrust of women after the failure of my marriage. Standing up, I took her in my arms and kissed her hello. My goodness, Abby said after returning my kiss. It must have been a good day. Got my first case on the first day in the office. And it's a rich guy. You and the major were right. Better office, better class of client. I wasn't smiling. Abby noticed my facial expression. You don't seem too happy about it. I shrugged my shoulders. Why not? She asked. It's a domestic, following a wife to prove she's having an affair. You don't like divorce cases, do you? I shook my head. Makes me feel like a peeping Tom. I've seen a number of marriages end due to the information I gathered. Mostly my investigations lead to a sad, sometimes violent result. All you're doing is gathering evidence and presenting it. Yep, that's what I do, gather evidence and present it. But I've seen a surprisingly equal number of self-absorbed men and selfish, scheming women screw over their spouses and partners with no thought of the consequences, especially for the children. Makes me wonder if happily ever after really exists. Noticing the hard look, I added, I am not talking about you and me, Abby. You better not be. I was just getting ready to bop you in the head to bring you to your senses, Abby said. Why did you take that kind of job if you hate them so much? I had to smile and shake my head. Truth be told, Robinson money whipped me into it. Now she raised an eyebrow. I am gonna follow his wife for a maximum of 2 weeks. I get $5,000 no matter what and $10,000 if I get the evidence he wants. I picked up the check from Robinson and showed it to her. He gave me the $5,000 up front. Taking Abby by the hand, I pulled her toward the door. Come on, let's go to dinner to celebrate, and then we'll come home and explore this happily ever after thing. It was just after 10:30 a.m. and the morning spring weather was perfect. I was sitting in my truck watching the entrance to a chic, upscale ladies' boutique. Mrs. Cynthia Robinson, my target and wife of my client, was shopping. She had gone into the shop at 9:30 and I was still waiting for her. And she's taking her own sweet time doing it, I said to the squirrel staring at me from the tree next to my truck. It was a warm spring day, and I had both of the windows down. People don't know or realize that this is mostly what you do as a PI. You wait and watch, then wait and watch some more. After 2 days and nights of following Mrs. Robinson, I am no closer to finding any information about an extramarital affair. Good old Cynthia is downright boring. Hell, she doesn't respond to the flirting from her tennis coach. I told the squirrel. I watched her yesterday, and the guy put the moves on her, but she either didn't notice or decided he wasn't worth the effort to knock him down a notch or two. The squirrel was barking and chirping at me to let me know he didn't like me parking near his tree. If you don't watch out, I'll put you in a stew pot, you mangy tree rat. Just then, good old Cynthia left the boutique. Now, in fairness, I have to say the good old part wasn't very accurate. Cynthia Robinson looked to be between 30 and 35. She had the fresh, innocent look of a young woman. If she was 18, you could put her on the cover of Teen magazine. Cynthia is tall and slender, but there is no doubt she is all woman, with bumps and curves in all the right places. Her long blonde hair and blue eyes just added to the thought that she must have been a teenage cheerleader at one point in her life. The only thing that made her less than perfect in my mind was that she spent an hour and a half in the store and didn't buy a thing. I knew that Jonathan Robinson, from the stories in the newspaper, had met her while she was doing a presentation of a new computer she was trying to sell to his company. Robinson was taken with her. He put a full-court press on her, and they were married after 6 months of dating. Although she didn't make the sale, she did gain a husband. Now, after only 2 years of marriage, Robinson thought she was cheating on him. For the first time, Cynthia didn't head for another tennis or golf lesson, and she didn't go to another expensive store for more useless shopping. She went to a little coffee shop on the near south side of St. Louis. The Robinsons lived in what could only be called a mansion on Lindell Boulevard across from Forest Park. The Benton Park Cafe and coffee shop was several miles from her house. She locked her Mercedes SLK Roadster and almost skipped into the shop. Cynthia moved quickly to a booth in the back, and I couldn't really see her. I'll have to go in and see who she's meeting, I said, not really happy about the possibility that my target would see and pay attention to me. I have a habit of talking out loud when I am on a stakeout. Sitting alone in my office or at home, I've been known to talk to myself. Sometimes it's the most intelligent conversion I can find. Slipping on a St. Louis Cardinals sweatshirt, putting on a St. Louis Rams hat, and donning big sunglasses, I got out of the truck and entered the shop. I waited to give my order to the young lady behind the counter while she finished up with another coffee junkie. As I waited, I turned and glanced at Cynthia. She and a guy sat across from each other with those big stupid coffee cups on the tabletop between them. I've never understood why coffee shops, or customers for that matter, wanted those huge cups. Before you could drink all that coffee, it would get cold, and if you chugged it while it was hot, you'd break out in a sweat and have to run to the bathroom. Cynthia was talking to a man, in what looked like an agitated state. The guy gave her a smile and reached over the table and took one of her hands in his. Then he said something in return, and Cynthia seemed to relax and sat back in her seat. The guy was good looking if you like the older matinee idol type. He looked to be 40 to 45. 6 feet, I guessed, and he looks fit. He had wavy brown hair combed straight back, and he wore nice clothes. Not the $3,000 suits that Mr. Robinson wore, but he was nicely dressed nevertheless. He was too far away to see his eyes. "How may I help you?" the young barista asked. She had finished with the other customer. "Cup of coffee," I told her. "We can whip that for you and make a nice latte, or we can add one of several different flavors." She was going to continue to tell me about all the foo-foo things they did with coffee. I held up my hand to stop her. "Coffee, black is all I want." She smiled sadly at me and went to fill the order of the uneducated man in front of her. I paid for my gallon cup of coffee and found a table near the front window. There was a clear line of sight to Cynthia and Mr. Matinee Idol. That was the reason I'd picked that seat. After an hour or so, I had just about finished my cold coffee when the two people I was watching stood to leave. He put his arms around Cynthia and then tried to kiss her, but she pulled away, shaking her head. Apparently, she wasn't ready to go the extra step, at least not in public. Cynthia left, got into her chariot, calling that Mercedes a car was an insult, and pulled away. Good thing, I thought as I made a quick exit to the men's room. Coffee doesn't normally run through me, but after drinking that huge cup, I thought I'd better make a pit stop before I continued. Finishing my business, I approached the young lady again. "I thought I recognized that couple that just left," I said. "Who are they?" "That's George Hamilton," she answered. "I've seen the lady in here with him, but I don't know her name." "George Hamilton, like the actor." "Who?" The girl had no idea who I was talking about. "Never mind, before your time, I guess. Have they been in here a lot?" 2 or 3 times a week for the last couple of weeks. "Ain't the internet amazing?" I said as I sat back from my computer monitor that afternoon. I had used Google to find out a lot of information about George Hamilton. He was a prominent figure in one of the charities where Cynthia volunteered. I learned that Jonathan Robinson and Hamilton had been at each other's throats several times over the years, and I figured Hamilton saw in Cynthia a way to get back at her husband. My guess was that he was going to seduce Cynthia and then rub Robinson's nose in the affair. During the next 11 days, I followed Cynthia Robinson. Hamilton and Cynthia had lunch or coffee several times, and dinner 4 times. I took pictures with my cell phone of each meeting. The secretive couple always met at out-of-the-way restaurants or coffee houses. Cynthia was careful to never go to a place that her friends, her husband's associates, or her husband might see them. I was able to sit in the booth next to them one evening and record their conversation, using the same phone I had used to take the pictures. Ain't technology wonderful? "She hasn't been to bed with him," I said as I finished the last day and night of observation. "It might be leading up to that, but I don't think old Cynthia is ready to go that far." This time my computer worked for me instead of against me. It seems the infernal machine has a grudge against me for some reason. It will go along fine, doing what I want, and then out of the blue it gets mad or something. When it does, it erases everything I'd been working on and sometimes on things I'd done before. I learned quickly to back up and save all my work in files when it was in a good mood. I finished typing a report for Robinson using Google Documents and printed it out. The next day was the last of the 2 weeks, and I had an appointment with him to go over what I'd found. At 10 the next morning, I walked into Robinson's office at 1 Med Square, the premier office building in downtown St. Louis. The secretary was wasting her time greeting and doing secretarial stuff. She should have been in the movies or on TV. The young woman, 25 to 28 I guessed, was more than beautiful. She was stunning. Tall, long blonde hair, with cornflower blue eyes that missed nothing and showed intelligence. "Mr. Steele?" she asked. I nodded and she pointed to a heavily carved wood door and said, "You can go right in. Mr. Robinson is expecting you." If the management company at 1 Met Square wanted to lease or sell high-end office space to a client, they could show them Robinson's office. 2 of the 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows offering a great view of the St. Louis riverfront, the Gateway Arch, and the Mississippi River. Nothing blocked the view, and you could see up and down the river and across into Illinois for miles. Robinson interrupted my looking at the view. "Do you have the evidence I want?" he asked and pulled a checkbook from the middle drawer of his desk. The desk was almost big enough to play football on. "I've got some information, but I don't think it's what you wanted." I slipped a folder with my report and the pictures inside. As Robinson looked at the pictures, I said, "The man is George Hamilton, but Mrs. Robinson hasn't done anything except meet him for coffee or lunch a few times and a couple of dinners." Moving a series of pictures in front of him, I said, "This is as sexually and physical as they've gotten, Mr. Robinson." The pictures showed the couple saying goodbye as they kissed on each cheek. the way they do in Hollywood, and Cynthia shaking Hamilton's hand. Mrs. Robinson may be having an emotional affair, but nothing physical. Robinson seemed upset. I know Hamilton, and he is a very persuasive man. Are you sure, Mr. Steele? I followed Mrs. Robinson from the time she left your house in the morning until she returned. Unless Hamilton was slipping into your bedroom after I left, they haven't been close to being intimate. He shook his head and sat down behind the huge desk. I heard him mumble, "Why isn't she?" I couldn't hear the rest of the question. Mr. Robinson, the first have a recording here that might explain why. I set my phone to play the recording, turned the speaker toward him, and pushed the button. The conversation I'd managed to tape was Cynthia telling Hamilton she was unhappy with her marriage. She said her husband didn't pay much attention to her, and she thought he'd only married her to be a trophy wife to impress his business associates. It was plain from the tone of her voice that Cynthia was sad, angry, and a little lost. Hamilton did his best to push her to let him be the one to make her life better. He was trying to take advantage of the situation. I am no expert on marriages or relationships, Mr. Robinson. It's above my pay grade. But it seems to me if you'll just talk to your wife, you two can iron out these problems. I held up my hand and told him, no need to write another check. I didn't get what you wanted. No, Robinson said and handed me another check for $5,000. You've given me a lot to think about. The look on his face wasn't of anger or sadness, I thought. It's more like determination. Noticing his look, I asked, "One last time piece of advice, sir?" He nodded in a distracted manner and I added, "Don't do anything stupid where Hamilton is concerned. It'd be a damn shame if you went to jail for that piece of garbage. Remember, karma's a bitch and it'll bite him in the butt soon enough." "I have no intention of going to jail, Mr. Steele," he replied. "Of that you can be sure." Later that day, Abby came breezing into my office around 2 o'clock. She works for a consulting firm that helped local and national charities with fundraisers, publicity, and anything else that would help them help other people. Sometimes she had to go to dinners, seminars, and even travel to other cities. But today she came to my place early. She came over and sat on my lap before I could get up and said, "How did your meeting with the client go?" Against most client confidentiality rules or guidelines, I sometimes discuss my cases with Abby. She's even worked on a couple with me. When I need date camouflage following or investigating someone, she's my cover. She also gives me a woman's perspective on things when I ask. I told her about the Robinsons and what I'd found out. Abby agreed that Cynthia wasn't ready to let things get physical with Hamilton, but it could happen. "I am glad to see you too," putting my arms around her as she sat down. I gave Robinson the information I'd gathered. He was pissed and I suggested he talk to his wife, and maybe they could work things out. I'd put the check under the edge of the large lamp on my desk. I pulled it out and handed it to Abby. He even gave me the other $5,000. "Well, I am glad that's over," Abby offered. "You were a bit of a bear while you worked this case. I'll never take another domestic case." I grinned at her. "Come on, let's go to Ragazzi's and celebrate." Abby shook her head. "I suggest we grill a couple of steaks and afterwards celebrate here at home." "Good thinking," I answered. Fatal boating accident on Alton Lake. The headline of the state and local section in the Sunday Post-Dispatch read. I was glancing at the paper, caught a name in the story and started to read. Abby walked into the living room and asked, "What's got you so interested in the paper?" "Guy was killed at Alton Lake. A guy I know." "Who?" "George Hamilton." The name sounds familiar. Who is George Hamilton? Remember that domestic case I handled about 3 months ago? For that rich guy Robinson. He's the one that I made an obscene amount of money from for 2 weeks' work. Abby nodded. Hamilton was the guy trying to seduce Mrs. Robinson. What happened to him? Paper says that Hamilton was on his boat Saturday afternoon and it exploded. Says there was a gas leak, and apparently the fumes were touched off by a spark or something. There are boating accidents on the lake every summer. It's nothing new. I stared at the paper for a few seconds. It's just funny. Not funny in a ha-ha way. More like it's strange. I mean, I never heard of the guy, and now I've heard about him twice in a few months. "Okay, I'll go with you," Matt said. Abby had asked him on Monday to accompany her to a charity fundraiser that coming weekend. "But my good suit will have to be enough. I am not wearing a tux. And you'll owe me for making me get dressed up." She smiled, hugged me, and gave me a kiss that left me breathing hard. Consider that a down payment on my bill. Saturday evening at 7, we entered the ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel. The hotel sat 1 block from the Mississippi shoreline, above the flood wall and just north of the Gateway Arch. It was one of the most expensive hotels in St. Louis and probably the nicest. The ballroom was a huge room and easily held the 200 invited guests. The tables were dressed with white tablecloths, china, and expensive centerpieces. Along 3 of the wall's free bars were kept busy. They'd better be free with the cost of the tickets, I thought. There was a bandstand and a dance floor toward the back of the room. I bet you couldn't play basketball on that dance floor, I said to Abby. But maybe you could get in a half-court game. Abby and I found our table. We were sitting with her boss and other people from her company. I got us a drink and looked around. At the head table, where all the big shots who'd given big bucks to the charity sat, I saw Jonathan and Cynthia Robinson. The mayor, a city alderman or two, and the police commissioner were at the same table. I nudged Abby and sort of pointed with my chin at the high roller table. That's the Robinsons sitting with the mayor, I told her. It had been about 6 weeks since I gave him my report. Your recent client? She asked, and I nodded. As we ate dinner, I said, you'd think a 5-star hotel like the Four Seasons would serve something better than this rubber chicken. I've had better food at the street vendors on Euclid Avenue. The dinner surprised me as to how ordinary it was. I thought the food belonged in a 2-star place at best. After dinner, we circulated greeting and talking to the other people, most of whom I wouldn't be able to point out again if they ran their Mercedes over me. I met more than one boyfriend or husband that looked like they'd rather be in the sports bar down the street. Abby and I approached the small crowd at the head table, saying hello to the big wigs. I'd met the mayor and I knew the police commissioner, although not on a first-name basis, having been a detective for the St. Louis police at one time. I never expected to see you at one of these affairs, Mr. Steele. Robinson was showing his typical condescending manner. After all, it's $1,000 a plate. Usually I wouldn't come to something like this, I replied. Then I continued, but I came into an extra $10,000 a couple of months ago and thought what better way to spend part of it by helping a charity. Robinson stiffened and his face got red, but he recovered quickly. Cynthia, my dear, this is a business associate. He neglected to give her my name. I did a sort of half bow. Mrs. Robinson, I am Matt Steele. Indicating Abby, I added, this is my friend Abigail Stewart. Cynthia extended her hand to first Abby and then to me. Have we met before, Mr. Steele? You look familiar. I could see Robinson stiffen again, but I let him off the hook. I don't believe we have, Mrs. Robinson. Nodding to both of them, I said, nice to meet you, Mrs. Robinson, and good to see you again, John. Please excuse us. I knew the John part would make the guy mad, but he deserved it after his comment to me. Abby and I walked back to our table. As we sat down, I said, looks like the Robinsons have made up. Don't you believe it? She replied. That lady is not a happy camper. You can see it in her eyes and the way she holds herself. She motioned back at the Robinsons and said, watch. The small orchestra started to play. Jonathan tried to take Cynthia's hand and lead her to the dance floor. She pulled her hand away, stepped past him, and went to the ladies' room. See, Abby said. Well, that's their problem. I took Abby's hand and leaned in close to her ear and whispered, I believe there was mention of further payment. Do you want to dance for a while, or get right to it? She smiled, took my hand, and led us out of the ballroom and up to a suite she'd reserved earlier. My Abby is a take-charge kind of gal. I was in my office on the following Sunday morning going over some paperwork and setting my schedule for the next week. Actually, I had my feet up on my desk with a cup of Kona coffee in my hand, reading the Sunday Post-Dispatch. I was leafing through the local section until I found the police blotter for Saturday and Saturday night. It was some I did every 2 or 3 days. I like to follow the reports in spite of not being a detective anymore. Abby had left to attend a brunch for a lady that was retiring from the charity business. One small paragraph caught my eye, and I read it in detail. Cynthia Robinson, a local resident and wife of mogul Jonathan Robinson, was found dead late Saturday evening. The body was discovered leaning out of the passenger door of her car, which was parked beneath the ramp up onto the Eads Bridge. My feet come off the desk, sat up straight, and put my coffee cup down. What the hell was Cynthia doing under the Eads Bridge? I asked out loud. There was no one in my office, so I didn't get an answer. Picking up my phone, I call Frank Wins, a St. Louis police detective. He and I had worked together while I was a detective. In fact, he was my training officer. He was now the commander of the detective section of the combined South Side precincts. What are you doing calling me on a Sunday? Frank asked. Hello to you too, Frank. Look, I just saw the blotter report on Cynthia Robinson. Anything you can tell me about it? That Mrs. Jonathan Robinson? I haven't even seen the write-up on it yet. Hell, I didn't know it happened until you just told me. Can you give me a call when you do? You know I can't discuss an ongoing investigation with civilians. Frank waited for several seconds and added, Of course, you're not exactly a civilian. Not sure what you are, but you're not a civilian. What's your interest? I'll let you know when I know more, I promise. Maybe I am tilting at windmills, but something is going on. Talk to you tomorrow, and don't bother me at home anymore. Frank hung up before I could make a smart reply. I picked up my coffee and stared out the window. There were no lovelies walking by as it was Sunday, but it was a nice view anyway. "Why are you staring out the window?" Abby asked as she entered my office. She came over with the coffee pot, poured me another cup, and sat on my lap. "Something's going on with the Robinsons." I handed her the paper and pointed to the report on Cynthia. First, George Hamilton, the guy that was trying to seduce Cynthia, dies in a boating accident, and a few weeks later Cynthia is found dead. "People die all the time," Abby replied. "It's just a coincidence. When two people who know each other die, it's a coincidence. When those same people know each other the way Hamilton and Cynthia knew each other, it's more than a coincidence. If you're bothered by it, call Frank and ask him to look into it." Already did, but the blotter report said it was a carjacking gone bad. "Sad as it is, that happens a lot," Abby said as she got off my lap and leaned against my desk. "Abby, you know the Robinsons. You know they have big bucks." She nodded and I said, "What was Cynthia doing in a low-rent neighborhood like under the Eads Bridge?" "So unless the police do a full investigation, I'm going to look into it. I'm going to look into it even if the police do their job. What can you do that the police can't?" She held up her hand before I could answer. "Never mind." I forgot for a second who I was talking to. I smiled at her and said, "I can find out things the cops can't because they got rules they have to go by." "Me? As the song says, I've got friends in low places. Friends that can get information and not worry about rules. At least they can and will if I ask them nice." My stupid cell phone shocked me awake. The ringtone was like an old-fashioned alarm clock and very loud. I glanced at the clock beside the bed and saw it was 7 a.m. Abby and I had decided that one night of payment for my services at the fundraiser wasn't enough. I hadn't got to sleep until almost 3. "What?" I screamed into the phone. "This better be money or good news, or I might shoot someone." "Threatening a police officer is a crime," Frank Wynn said and chuckled. "Why are you calling me at the break of dawn, Frank?" "Serves you right for calling me at home on a Sunday. Now do you want the full report on Cynthia Robinson or not?" I nodded my head and then remembered. I was on the phone. "Yes, sir, please, sir. If you could find the time, sir." And then in a louder voice, "Since you woke me up at an hour only fit for mad dogs and Englishmen." Frank laughed again. "Okay." Mrs. Robinson was found in her car. Sort of. The top half of her body was across the passenger's seat and her legs were still outside. She had been beaten severely and looks like she tried to get back to her car, or to her cell phone which was in her purse on the console. The Emmy hasn't finished yet, but there is a gunshot wound to the back of her head, at the base of her skull. Looks to be a small caliber weapon, maybe a .22. My guess, that's the cause of death. The report states it was a carjacking or mugging gone bad? I questioned, but in a puzzled tone. That's what the patrolman said. I was quiet for several seconds, almost a half a minute. Then I said, "Something's hinky here, Frank. Something doesn't add up." "Pray tell me, old great and omnipotent detective," he questioned with a sarcastic voice. "Tell me why there is something hinky. Come on, Frank, cut the crap. Quit being pissed off at me and listen." I waited a couple of seconds, and before he could spout off again, I continued. "The report says that it was a mugging or carjacking gone bad. But if that was what happened, why was her purse still there? The report said it was on the console, didn't it? For that matter, why was the car still there? A mugger would have taken the purse. Oh, and check for her jewelry. A mugger would have taken that too. A carjacker, willing to kill for her car, would have just rolled her out of it and drove it off. And what was she doing on the passenger side?" I paused and added, "This wasn't a theft gone too far. This was a murder, plain and simple." Now it was Frank's turn to be silent for several seconds. "I need to bring this up to the detectives on the case," he said. "I'll be in touch." And he hung up without waiting for my reply. I stared at the wall for a few minutes and thought about the deaths of Hamilton and now of Cynthia. Even though it was early, I called a guy I knew at the main precinct of the St. Louis Police Department. "Hey, Ricky, it's Matt Steele. You still do consulting work on the side?" Ricky Willard was one of, and according to him, the best, of the small group of cybercrimes specialists that work for the police. He checked into things people, some of which were really bad, did using computers, all legal and in the public domain if you knew how to access the information. If there was someone better at delving into a person's electronic footprint, I'd never met or even heard of them. Ricky had been in college and was running a very lucrative sports betting book and came to the attention of the St. Louis police. Apparently, one of his clients felt he had been hosed and contacted the cops. The investigation also showed that Ricky was, for a hefty price, changing people's grades in the college's computer records. He was arrested and charged with fraud, gambling, running a gambling ring, and a bunch of other crimes. But just before his trial, Ricky pointed out some flaws in the police department's computers, and a plea bargain was struck. Ricky would be put on probation for 2 years and do 6 months of community service. The community service would be in the cyber crimes department of the St. Louis Police. That had been 3 years previous, and he was now a paid employee. He sometimes did side jobs, like background checks, getting financial information and other information stored on a computer network somewhere. If it was on a computer, Ricky could find it. Hey, Mr. Steele. Yeah, I still do side jobs. As long as they're legal, you understand. Then Ricky laughed. What do you need? Meet me for lunch at the Flying Saucer, and before you ask, the lunch is on me. I've got a little job for you. Ricky agreed to meet me at 1 p.m., just after the lunch crowd rush. After showering and scraping the whiskers off my face, I dressed in what for me the height of fashion. I wore dark brown slacks, a pale blue on blue pin striped shirt with a dark brown knit tie, and a tan cashmere sports jacket. After meeting Ricky to see what he could find out on short notice about the Robinsons, I decided I might have to pay my condolences to Jonathan Robinson for the loss of his wife. No matter what Ricky found in his inquiries, I wanted to see how Robinson was taking his wife's death and do it early before he had a chance to build up defenses. The coincidence of Hamilton's and Cynthia's death made me think Robinson had something to do with one or both of the killings. I saw Ricky's beat-up old Chevy Impala in the parking lot of the Flying Saucer Draft Emporium and parked next to it. Ricky is the only person that drives a vehicle that looks as ratty as my truck. But just like my truck, under that faded paint, dents, and rust lived the heart of a car racer. Both vehicles had been worked on by the same genius mechanic to be classic. You can't tell a book by its cover, Cars. I drove my truck mostly because it allowed me to blend in when I was working, and if need be blow the doors off of cars I had to follow. Not sure why Ricky felt he needed a camouflage speed racer. The Flying Saucer was about equal distance between police headquarters and One Met Square, so it seemed to be the best place for our meeting. Besides, the Saucer had some of the best burgers in town and over 30 kinds of beer on tap. I wouldn't taste the brew at lunch, but since Abby was working late, I thought I might come back and make up for it. Ricky had a huge burger in front of him and a bottle with the name Big Sky Moostrule on the label. I have to get back on time today, so I started early. Got the big cheese coming in on an inspection tour. He grinned and said, "Of course the guy hardly knows the difference between a computer monitor and a full workstation, but we have to put on the show." He pointed at his beer and asked, "Want one? It's an IPA from Canada?" "No thanks. What I want is for you to look into Jonathan and Cynthia Robinson. I'd like to know as much about them as you can find out. Legally, of course." "Of course, legally. I am appalled that you would think I would do otherwise." Ricky grinned. "Now that we've got all that moral crap out of the way, what do you really need to know?" "I am not sure exactly. There have been 2 deaths that might be connected to Robinson. His wife is one of them. I guess I just want to see if there are any red flags in his life." I hesitated for a few seconds. "I was serious about you not doing anything illegal. I don't want you to go to jail for me over this." Ricky became more serious. "You know, if it hadn't have been for Raleigh and Tully, I probably would have gone to jail. They're good people in my book, and you're their friend, so that buys you a lot of goodwill. And I am not forgetting that scrape you got me out of." I'd come across Ricky one night in a less than reputable bar. It was when I was working on the Hunter Blaine case. Apparently he and another customer were having a serious disagreement over who had lost the pool game. The other guy pulled a knife on Ricky and things were about to get real interesting. Stepping into the argument, I convinced the other guy that Ricky wasn't worth the trouble. I convinced him by taking the knife away from him and threatening to put it someplace that would make him sitting down very uncomfortable. Ricky stuffed the last of the burger in his mouth, emptied the beer bottle, and stood up. "Back to the salt mines. I'll give you a call no later than tomorrow noon." "Thanks, Ricky," I replied. "I'll send you a check for your work." "No need. You pay for lunch and we're good." He turned to leave and then returned to the table. "Don't be surprised if you get a call from a number you don't recognize. I might be using an untraceable cell. See ya." Ricky turned and left humming the theme from Star Trek. Just past 2 p.m., after parking my truck in a commercial lot, I entered the One Met Square building and took the elevator to Robinson's office. The same beautiful secretary or receptionist greeted me as I came into the large foyer to the office, and my opinion of her intelligence rose as she picked up her phone and said, "Hello, Mr. Steele. I'll see if Mr. Robinson is available." We'd had only met for a couple of minutes a couple of months ago, and yet she remembered me. Smart lady. Of course I have that effect on a lot of women. They remember me. For good or bad, some remember me. She put down the phone and motioned toward the big polished metal door that led to the throne room. Robinson sat at his desk, looking busy, and made me wait for about 2 minutes before he looked up and said, "Yes? Why are you here?" And with a haughty look continued, "I am done with you. I have no need of your services again, Steele." "Steele, not Mr. Steele. just Steele pronounced like it left a bad taste in his mouth. My dislike for good old Jonathan increased. The way Robinson had spoken to me and his obvious disdain made up my mind on how I wanted to handle this. I sat down in one of the chairs in front of his desk and sort of slouched down. My condolences on the death of your wife. Oh, and on the death of your friend George Hamilton too. Robinson actually snarled. Hamilton was no friend of mine and good riddance to him. I gave him a sarcastic grin and commented, interesting that Hamilton was the first one you mentioned. Instead of your wife, I mean. Well, of course I am distraught about Cynthia. Robinson tried to backpedal. I am grief-stricken, but the living must go on. Just from your actions I am sure you are. Fixing Robinson with grim stare. Mr. Robinson, I think you had something to do with your wife's death. Fact is, I think you were involved in George Hamilton's boating accident as well. I stood and walked to the door. Stopping, I turned and added, I am gonna look into it, Jonathan. If I am right, you're in deep crap, and your money isn't gonna help you. Robinson stood, and if looks could kill, I would have fallen down dead. You can't prove anything, and I'll make your life hell if you come after me. You understand? You cheap gumshoe? 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 I answered. Nobody has used the term gumshoe since the Maltese Falcon and Sam Spade. You're a little behind the times, Jonathan. I tried to slam the door as I left, but it had one of those gadgets that closed it slowly. It wasn't very satisfying. Sitting at my desk the next morning, I was practicing my stealth stakeout talents. Actually, I was watching the young ladies that worked in the nearby offices walk by my window. I had my morning coffee and was settling into my important task when my phone's annoying ringtone shattered my mood. Matt Steele, I answered. It's Ricky, Mr. Steele. I've got some stuff on the Robinsons. He didn't wait for to reply and continued. I ran the financials on them. I know Mr. Robinson's supposed to be some rich big shot, but it was his wife that had the money. Very interesting. You sure? I heard they met when Cynthia was working in sales trying to sell a new computer system to Robinson. That may be, but Mrs. Robinson owned the computer company. Maybe she just liked working for something she built. Another thing I found out, the Robinsons weren't all that loving with each other. They tried counseling for a couple of months, but it didn't take. It seems Mrs. Robinson was gonna divorce him. You found out all this on the internet? The financials and business background, yes. The other. Well, a friend of mine works for the Robinsons' lawyer. I called her, and she told me what she heard in the office. She said Mr. Robinson signed a prenup, and he would be left nothing but the clothes on his back if they divorced. Even that fine car he drives is leased for him by his wife. The man was gonna lose everything. Of course, now he's inherited all Mrs. Robinson's money. Your friend could get in trouble for violating the attorney and client confidentiality rules. She might have someone ratted her out. But who would do that? How'd you get this friend to tell you all this? Let's just say she was paying back a debt. Ricky chuckled. Seems back in the day, she needed to pass a course to get her degree. I was able to help with her grade. He laughed again and added, of course, I wouldn't do anything like that now. It's against the law and all, and I've reformed. Thanks, Ricky. I owe you one. See ya. I leaned so far back in my office chair that I almost tipped over. Now I've got a motive, Jonathan. And it's beginning to look like I was right after all. You've got that working on a case look, Abby said at dinner. We were at Ragazzi's, and I must have been staring at my plate lost in thought. Abby's statement pulled me back to the present. I nodded and smiled. You know me too well. I am starting a case, but this one is all for me. I don't have a client. No client. What case? I am gonna prove that Jonathan Robinson had his wife killed. Probably had George Hamilton hit as well. Why makes you think Mr. Robinson had anything to do with his wife's death, or with Hamilton's for that matter? You remember what I found out about Cynthia and Hamilton? Abby nodded. At the fundraiser, I told you I thought they'd gotten past it, but you said they hadn't. You even pointed out the way Cynthia was acting toward her husband. She nodded again and said, Mrs. Robinson didn't want to dance with him or hold hands or anything. She gave off an angry vibe. Abby gave me a small smile and added, most men wouldn't see it, or if they did, wouldn't understand it. You were no different. You're right. I didn't see it until you pointed it out to me. But later when Cynthia was killed, I started to think about the way she acted, and then about Hamilton's accident. Like I told you, I don't believe in coincidences, and I had a friend dig into Robinson's background. I hope you didn't have your friend do anything illegal. Most of what he found is public record. Maybe hard to find, but it is in the public record. I motioned to our server for the check. Come on, let's get out of here. As we stood to leave, I quickly kissed her. I want to get back to our date and let the rest of it go away. I handed Abby into my Cadillac CTS coupe. This was my meet clients and put on a good front vehicle. I had two other cars. a beat-up-looking old Chevy pickup that was my work vehicle and had the heart of a NASCAR racer. The other Chariot was a '63 Corvette split-window coupe. I drove it on weekends and on special occasions. The windows were down and the warm spring breeze brought in the scent of several fresh-cut lawns in the neighborhood around Ragazzi's. We were driving slowly as I didn't especially want to get to our destination. I was taking Abby back to her apartment instead of to my place. She was going on a business trip at 0:30 the next morning and would be gone for 2 days. At her door, I held her for a few seconds, kissed her, and turned back toward my caddy. The next morning, I met with my realtor and finished the paperwork on 2 deals. 1. We closed on the sale of the house I'd gotten in my divorce. Seems the people renting it fell in love with the place. They approached my realtor, who managed the place for me, about buying it. I told him to quote some inflated price and they'd forget about it. They didn't blink and accepted the price. It was a case of someone being money-whipped all over again. The second deal was closing on the house that I'd bought, hopefully for Abby and me. We had been talking about and sort of halfway looking for a place for several months. I'd always been a fan of the stately homes in several older neighborhoods of St. Louis built and developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, so I bought a big house in the historic Compton Heights section of the city. It had been built in 1897 for a railroad tycoon, but it had fallen onto hard times over the years. I was planning my surprise for Abby's return as I walked back to my truck when my stupid cell phone gave its blaring ring. I didn't recognize the number on the screen. "Matt Steele," I answered. "Hey, Mr. Steele. It's Ricky Willard." "Yeah, Ricky. You said you owed me one. Any chance I might collect on that, Mr. Steele?" "I'll help you if I can. What's going on?" "A friend of mine, Stella Reyes, is in trouble. You know that young lady who got that information about the Robinsons for us? The one that works for Mrs. Robinson's attorney?" I nodded and then realized he couldn't see me. "I remember, but you never told me her name. Did she get in trouble for telling you the stuff she did?" "No, sir. It's something else. Stella's family is kind of on hard times. She's the only one working and her mother is sick and needed some kind of special medical equipment. So Stella tried to raise the money. She'd only been at her job for a year and they are renting a sort of rundown apartment and the banks and finance companies wouldn't help. So she went to a loan shark for the money. Not the best thing to do, Ricky. Those guys are like vampires. They'll suck the life right out of you." "Yeah, I know. Anyway, Stella is struggling to make the payments. What with the high interest rate and all. If she misses the payment date by even a day, the guy charges her a week's VIG." "Oh, VIG is the interest the guy charges for the loan. I know what vigorish is, Ricky. Remember I was a cop? How much is the shark charging and how much is Stella into him for? That butt is charging her 2% a day on the $4,000 she borrowed. That's over $500 a week. Even then he claims he's giving her a special rate and keeps making hints that she could work off her debt in a much more personal way. She's making the payments, but she doesn't clear much at her job, so the principal itself never seems to decrease. Stella doesn't know what to do. I thought you might have some ideas." "Who is the loan shark?" "Guy named Tom Ledoux. He's called Tommy the Turtle." "Yeah, I know Tommy. I busted him a couple of times when I was a detective. Somehow he always got a plea deal or beat the rap." I thought for a few seconds. "Ricky, find out how much VIG Stella has paid and where she meets Tommy. I'll have a talk with him. I'll get right back to you, Mr. Steele." An hour later, he called again. "Stella says she meets him at Dee's place on Barton. That's down in the Soulard area. She's been paying him $200 every week for 2 months, but she's been late a couple of times and still owes him $3,800. She'll never get him paid off at this rate. She told him she wouldn't pay the high interest, but Ledoux said he'd hurt her mother if she quit paying. Like I said, I'll go have a talk with Tommy and get him to cut Stella some slack, Ricky. Let you know how I make out. See ya." Abby was going to be out of town that evening, so I thought I'd go to Dee's place for a burger and a beer. Might even meet some old friends, I said to my truck. The Soulard neighborhood of St. Louis was basking in a resurgence of development. As in other historic areas of the city, people were moving back to the old neighborhoods. They were revamping and rebuilding the houses. Most of the newer residents were young up-and-coming couples, a few senior citizens that had lived there for years, and because of the inexpensive houses, larger families were coming back as well. Of course, as the areas drew more people, the housing prices rose. Because the people were coming back, the businesses and the shops were returning. Dee's place, a sports bar, was one of the recently places. It had been a home at one time in the past, but a new large picture window had been cut into the brick wall, and a carved wooden door led into the dimly lit interior. There was the typical long bar down one wall with tables and chairs against the opposite wall, only 10 to 15 feet away. Walking into Dee's at 7 p.m., I saw Tommy sitting in a sort of side room. He was called Tommy the Turtle because he always ducked back into his shell when trouble started. Like a turtle, if the city police got too interested in his business, he'd change the bar he worked out of and cut back on getting new customers. I knew he'd have to be there fairly early if he was collecting from people when they got off work. Tommy was sitting in a wrap-around booth against the back wall. He was dressed to the nines, wearing a deep blue silk shirt, a lot of gold chains around his neck, and cream-colored linen pants. Come on, Tommy, I thought. Nobody wear linen pants in St. Louis. Next to Tommy was his enforcer Jimmy Rice, who was called Sarge. He said he'd been a master sergeant in the Army during Desert Storm. I think the closest Jimmy ever got to being an NCO was working at the NCO club as a busboy. Although he was so big, I thought he might have been a tank. Where Tommy dressed up in what he thought of high fashion, Rice wore a chambray work shirt unbuttoned down to below his massive chest and a pair of Army BDU black pants similar to what the SEALs wear. He did have one gold chain around his neck with a sort of charm that was the stripes of a Army sergeant's emblem. "Hello, Tommy," I said. "Robbed any old ladies lately? What do you want, Steele? You ain't a cop no more, so we got no business between us." "That's your second mistake, Tommy. First, we do have business to discuss. Take a hike, Steele." Tommy motioned to his leashed giant employee. "Get rid of this guy, Jimmy," he ordered. Jimmy was slumped in the booth and took up one whole side. "Man's gotta be 6 feet 6 inches and 350 pounds, I thought as I stopped at the front edge of the table. He looked to be almost as big around as he was tall. Jimmy stared at me in a "don't screw with me" attitude. Then at Tommy's order, he started to get up. Since moving into my new office and trying for better clients, I had started dressing a bit better. Instead of St. Louis Cardinals or Rams satin jackets over a sweatshirt, I wore collared shirts and sports jackets when the weather permitted. During the hot, humid summer months, I usually wear Hawaiian-type shirts and don't tuck them into my pants. I flipped back the side of the sports jacket I was wearing, which allowed the butt of my Glock to show. I put my hand on the gun. "No need to get up on my account. Why don't you just stay put?" I suggested. I thought for a couple of seconds the behemoth was going to stand up anyway. Might not be a good thing to shoot him, I thought. It might piss him off. Jimmy solved my problem by sitting back in the booth. "You said I made 2 mistakes, Tommy said. What was the other one?" "Tommy, you've got a customer named Stella Reyes. She's a friend of mine. She borrowed $4,000 from you and has been making weekly payments, but after 2 months, she's only paid off $200 of the principal. That's because of the VIG you're charging. That was your second mistake, or maybe it was your first, because I wouldn't be here if you hadn't got your hooks into Stella. So, that's gonna stop, Tommy." I held up my hand to halt his complaint. "I don't expect you to forgive the debt. She'll pay you what she owes you. But there won't be any more VIG charged to Stella. You've been charging her over 5 bills a week for 2 months. That's $4,000 in profit for you. That's enough. You can't tell me how to run my business, Steele. You got no jurisdiction here. Got no proof I did anything wrong. Like you said earlier, Tommy, I am not a cop anymore. I don't have to prove anything to a court. I don't have to follow the rules anymore either, so I am gonna give one warning. Let Stella off the hook." Tommy pointed at my Glock. "What are you gonna do if I don't? You gonna shoot me?" I gave Tommy a grim smile and winked at him. Seeing the look on my face, Tommy sat back and sort of deflated. "Okay, Steele, you're just crazy enough to do me. I'll stop charging the bitch the VIG, but she better damn well pay what she owes." I tossed my business card down on the table in front of him. "If she doesn't pay, call me. Don't deal with it like you usually do. Don't break her fingers or an arm. Call me. Because you've been so understanding, I'll see that you get paid." I stepped back. "Good to see you, Tommy, and nice doing business with you." I nodded at Jimmy and walked out of the bar. As I drove back to my apartment at 10, I used my cell to call another less than legal citizen. "Hi, is Jake there?" A few seconds later, he got on the phone. "Hey, Jake. Matt Steele. Like to talk to you tonight." I listened to him for a while and said, "Meet you tonight at Molly's around midnight." Returning to my apartment, I changed into something a little rougher. Molly's would not be featured on a Chamber of Commerce tour of the fine establishments of St. Louis. It wasn't an upstanding place. Over the years, it had been closed down more than once by the police. The bar was on the less than upscale end of the de Balavier Strip. The street had once been an important mecca for blues and fine dining. Now the Strip was one step away from being a demilitarized zone between the halves of the grand houses along Forest Park and have-nots north along de Balavier Street. Jake Stedman, aka Jake the Snake, was a snitch of the highest caliber as well as a con man and a thief. If anything even slightly illegal went on in St. Louis, Jake knew or could find out about it. He did his dirty work in such a way that the rest of the people in his world knew nothing about his activities. Jake was called the Snake because of his luck or ability or whatever in slithering out of charges and actions by the authorities. While I was a detective, I arrested Jake with over 5 grams of high-grade heroin in his possession. He swore it was for personal use, but it was more than enough to get him charged as a dealer. In exchange for cutting him a break, he agreed to be a source of information for me. The intel he provided led to several arrests and convictions of more hardened criminals. I was going to use him again to see if he could get a line on the deaths of Hamilton and Cynthia. Molly's hadn't changed over the years and was still a place that no sane person would go if he wasn't a regular. I left my jacket in the car, pulled my shirt tail out of my pants, and walked into the dive. My shirt got caught up on the butt of my pistol and showed the world I was armed, just as I intended. The bar was empty except for the scruffy old bartender and Jake. I could have saved the dramatics with my pistol, so I flipped the shirt tail back over the Glock. I ordered a beer and specified a bottle because I wouldn't use a draft from Molly's to wash my truck. It might finish rusting out the fenders. Throwing a 5 on the bar, I grabbed my beer and joined Jake at his table. I explained my thinking, without mentioning names, and told Jake to look around. It'd be good to know if whoever did the job on the lady was just some bum or a contract worker. See what you can find out and give me a call. There's no time limit on this, Jake, but I'd like something sooner rather than later. Okay. Don't know what I can find, Steele, Jake protested. I'm not into strong arm or rough stuff. Jake, you know something about everything that goes on in this city, so don't give me that crap. Some of the info you've given me led to your competitors going away for a long time, so it's payback time. I stood and dropped my card on the table. That's my new number. Call me. One more night without Abby. I thought the next evening. She'll be back tomorrow, and I can show her the house. My cell interrupted my train of thought. Matt Steele. Hi, Steele, it's Jake. Got some information for you. That was quick. Yeah. Well, the sooner I put some distance between us, the better. He hesitated for a few seconds. I found out a guy named Wiley Thornton and his crew did the job on a guy named Hamilton and a woman named Robinson. I am guessing from what you told me they are the people you talked about. That's them, I replied. How'd you find out about Thornton and what makes you think he's the man? You know how it is, a friend of a friend has a friend type thing. Seems Thornton and his boys were trying to impress another guy at a bar on the hill. This other guy works for Vito Cilliere. You know, the head of the mob family here in St. Louis. Looks like Thornton is trying to move up in the world. He was bragging that he got 100 big ones for the 2 jobs. How many in his crew? 2 other guys, but he's the force. He's the one you'll have to deal with. Jake hesitated and added, I don't have a lot of love for you, Steele, but you've always been straight with me, so I am gonna warn you. From what I've heard, this Wiley is a whole suitcase full of crazy. Okay, thanks, Jake. If your info is right, that'll put us about even. I won't bother you again. Good. All I do is get in trouble around you, Steele. See you around. Now I had a direction to go. At least I had a name. On the way home, I put Wiley behind me and thought about how surprised Abby was going to be with the house. I just hoped she liked the place as much as I do. Why are we in this neighborhood? Abby was puzzled. She had taken 2 days off after returning from her business trip. Abby said they'd gotten enough of her time for a couple of days. We both like older homes, so I thought we'd take a tour of some of them, I replied. Besides, it's a nice spring day, and neither of us gets out in the sun enough. The tour consisted of driving through the streets of the Compton Heights neighborhood of St. Louis. At one time, this area was the place to build a home if you were a very successful and rich businessman or politician in the city. Many of the homes had been built and owned by railroad moguls, land tycoons, and riverboat owners. Other areas, with expansive homes had been formed, but few rivaled the grand, stately buildings in Compton Heights. Turning onto Longfellow Boulevard, I slowed my Corvette and pointed out some of the classic homes. Stopping in the street, we looked at one especially impressive building. The beautiful old home was built of white quarried stone cut out of a bluff which at the time was about 50 miles up the Mississippi from St. Louis. Now the bluff was near one of the city's suburbs. It had a garage, built out of the same stone. It had been a large carriage house back in the day. The garage sat at the back of the almost 1-acre property, and the driveway to it ran through a wide covered porch. In the old days, visiting guests could climb down out of their carriages avoiding bad weather by using this entry into the house. That's a really nice one, I said. Abby nodded as she took in the stone front of the house and the carved mahogany double-door entrance. Let's take a closer look, I suggest, and drove the Corvette up the driveway, through entry porch into the backyard. I parked in front of the carriage house. Matt, what are you doing? Abby asked. I sure the owner won't appreciate a stranger driving into his yard. I hear the owner's a nice guy. He won't mind. Getting out of the car, I walked around and helped Abby to stand. Let's take a closer look, I said and started toward the house. Abby held back and I started laughing. I've teased you enough, I guess. Abby, I bought this house for us. It has 6 bedrooms, 4 baths, and is 5,899 square feet. There's a lot of work to do in it, but we can live at my apartment for the 5 or 6 months that the renovation and modernization will take. I paused as she got used to the idea of the home. That is if you like the place, of course. If you don't, we'll fix it up, put it on the market, and find another house. Abby grabbed me in a big hug. Don't even think about selling our house. Let's go inside. The rest of that day, first I led her on a tour of her new house. And then she led me around the rooms of the house, pointing out the things that needed to be repaired and added. Only the growing darkness as the sun went down stopped our exploring. I had neglected to have the utilities turned on, an oversight that I corrected the next morning, calling in a few favors and asking for a few. The electricity and water were turned on the same day I requested. Abby and I were able to continue our inspection and note-taking until almost midnight the next day. Then the job of finding the right contractor to do the work on the house began. We finally decided on a father and son company as they seemed to have the same vision as we did. Other than a very few suggestions, my part in the rest of the process consisted in writing checks. I did insist, and Abby let me have my way, that the den was to be my sanctuary. Did your friends in low places find something? Abby asked. I was getting ready to go out for a night looking for information from some other friends in low places about Wiley Thornton and a possible connection to Jonathan Robinson. Yes, they did, but I've got to see a few others to get more information. I purposely didn't mention the contract killer I was looking for. Abby has a tendency to worry too much. I'll be home around 1. Don't wait up. I kissed her, left the apartment, and climbed into my trusty truck. Some of the places I was going to, I didn't want to drive my Caddy, and definitely not my Corvette. Neither would have lasted 5 minutes parked on the street. My expedition, an investigating or fact-finding mission, whatever you want to call it, the first night didn't have a good result. I decided to give it another night, and if I didn't get anything, I'd try something else. What else I didn't know, but I'd try something as soon as I thought of it. The next evening at midnight, I left the aptly named dive bar on the seedy end of Lindell and headed for my truck. As I started to unlock the door, I saw in the reflection in my driver's side window of someone driving up behind me and stopping. The man got out of the car and started toward me. I whirled around and the man stopped in his tracks about 20 feet away. The guy was average height and weight with dark hair. I couldn't tell the color as it was dark with few streetlights around. He was wearing dark jeans and a sweatshirt with the sleeves cut off. He definitely wasn't dressed like a model for GQ magazine. The only outstanding thing about him was the revolver that he held down by his leg. Another man climbed out of the passenger's side and came toward where his buddy was stopped. "Get in the car," the gun holder ordered as he motioned with his weapon. I shook my head and slowly pulled my jacket away from my right side. This allowed the Glock on my hip to show. "Come on, pal," the second man said. "You better do it. Jasper will shoot ya. He don't care." "Shut up, Boyd," Jasper ordered. "Get in the car, Steele. I am not going to tell you again. Our boss wants to see ya." "Oh, that's good," I replied. "Now we know each other and can talk like gentlemen." Jasper was puzzled that I didn't seem to be afraid of him and his gun. He turned to look at Boyd, and when he did, I put my right hand on the butt of my pistol. Boyd pulled his own revolver from his waistband. I asked, "Who's your boss?" "You'll know soon enough. Get in the car. If you don't, we'll pay a visit to that bitch you run around with." Jasper started to bring his gun up, but saw my hand on my weapon and stopped with it about halfway to pointing it at me. "I am not going with you, Jasper, and you made a mistake calling my lady a bitch. I don't let things like that slide." I watched him tensed up and added, "That looks like a .38 you're carrying and a wheel gun at that. You may get off the first shot before I can draw. Even if you hit me, odds are you won't kill me." Boyd and Jasper looked at each other again. "This is a semi-automatic Glock .45 with a hair trigger I am carrying. Before you can get off a second shot, I'll have put 2 in you, and maybe 2 in good old Boyd there too. So to quote Dirty Harry, do you feel lucky, punk?" I guess they felt I was full of it, or maybe they did feel lucky. They both raised their weapons to fire. As a detective, while with the police and in my own business, I've never practiced for a quick draw, but I was fast enough that night. Jasper got off 1 round, which went over my head, and didn't get a chance at a second shot. Boyd never got a shot off at all. 2 quick shots, called a double tap, hit Jasper in the shoulder and in the leg. Another shot knocked Boyd off his feet. I'd learned the double tap from Jacob Tully, a former master gunnery sergeant in the United States Marines. He'd been the instructor at the police pistol range when I was a detective. Neither Jasper or Boyd would die, although they might wish they had. With quick medical attention, they would survive our little encounter. Stepping closer to the men, I kicked their pistols out of reach and squatted down. "You boys are hit pretty bad," I offered. I took out my phone and held it up where they could see it. "Y'all want me to call an ambulance for you?" Jasper moaned and said, "Come on, Steele, get us some help. I am bleeding to death here. Tell me who sent you, and I'll make the call." Jasper shook his head. "Okay, the nearest hospital is 10 blocks north. But I don't think you can make it, Jasper." I stood and took 2 steps toward my truck. "Wiley Thornton was the one," Jasper said. I nodded my head and he added, "Wiley said to make you stop asking questions about that guy Hamilton and the broad. Mrs. Robinson?" Jasper nodded. "His boss told him to make you stop. Put a stop to your intrusive meddling," he said. I heard him and had to ask Wiley what he meant. "Who's the boss?" I asked. "Some rich jerk. I don't know his name, but I heard Wiley call him Robinson." "Gotcha," I thought. "Now I am gonna put you away." "Okay, Jasper, I'll call an ambulance for you." I was lucky to get the information from Jasper before he went into shock. Dialing 911. I reported the shooting and requested an ambulance for the wannabe kidnappers. Next, I called Frank Wins. "Do you enjoy waiting until I am sleeping to call Matt?" Frank said in a raspy voice. "I just shot 2 guys outside of the dive bar. They were trying to kidnap me. I've already called 911. "On my way," Frank answered. The sleepiness was gone. "Don't say nothing until I get there." The police arrived and I laid my Glock on the hood of my truck as the patrol car pulled up. I didn't want to get shot, and I especially didn't want to get shot by mistake by an overeager patrolman. The EMTs were next on the scene and called for a second ambulance. About 10 minutes after the medics arrived as they were treating the men, an unmarked police car pulled to a stop behind the attempted kidnapper's car. Frank made good time, I thought. "Are you okay?" Frank asked. "What happened, Matt?" "Those 2, I said, pointing at the 2 being tended to by the EMTs. "Asked me to go with them. I refused their invitation, and they took offense to my rejection of their hospitality." "Come on, Matt, get serious." "I am serious, Frank. The big one, that's Jasper, told me to get in their car. He said his boss wanted to see me, and then he threatened me with that gun." I pointed to the evidence envelope that the first on-scene patrolman was holding. I gave them a chance, but they thought they were better than they are. "The patrolman's got the other guy's gun as well. Who's their boss?" Frank asked. I shook my head. "Matt, I know you. I'd bet my pension you persuaded them to give you his name." I shook my head again, refusing to answer. "You know as well as I do that now that they are being medically treated, they'll clam up. Give me a break here. I'll let you know when I can, Frank. If I tell you, you'll have to go investigate. That will just warn the guy and he'll get away or lawyer up and you guys will get nothing. My way, we got a chance at putting this guy away." I put my hand on Frank's shoulder. "Promise, I'll let you know as soon as you can make an arrest and make it stick." Before Frank could continue arguing with me, another unmarked police car pulled to a stop behind Frank's car. I knew Frank would be lead detective on the case, but because it was a shooting, the watch commander would get involved too. I couldn't believe who the commander was when he got out of the car. This night can't get any better, I thought as I saw Captain Joe Harper come toward us. Harper was the cause of me losing my marriage and my job. "My, how the mighty have fallen," I said as Harper walked over to where Frank and I were talking. "Being a captain and all, you must be on someone's crap list if you have to come out at midnight to cover a shooting." He refused to answer me and questioned the patrolman that was first on scene and then talked to Frank. After talking to them for a few minutes, Harper turned to me. "What did you do, Steele?" I told the patrolman. I told Detective Wins, and I am done talking until my attorney gets here. "Still hate me, don't you, Steele?" "I don't want to bust your bubble, Harper, but I haven't thought of you more than once or twice in the last 5 years. You're not important enough to remember or hate." "You put those men in the hospital?" Harper protested as I started walk away. "It could have just as easily been body bags," I replied. "Now unless you're gonna arrest and charge me, I am going home." I turned and walked back to my truck, noticing the bullet hole at the top edge of the door. Guess Jasper wasn't as bad as I thought, I said to myself. I was surprised to see Abby sleeping on my big couch when I got to my apartment. Apparently she'd been waiting up for me and didn't make it. I slipped off my boots, got behind her. She woke up a little. "I fell asleep," she said in a fogged-over voice. "Sorry, I'll make you some coffee and you can tell me about your night." "Tell you in the morning," I replied as I pulled her back against me. "Go back to sleep." "Love you," Abby said. She snuggled closer to me and her breathing deepened again. A few minutes later I fell asleep too. Abby poured us an after-breakfast coffee the next morning. "What's going on in that devious mind of yours, Matt? You've been staring at the wall for a couple of minutes now. I'm gonna ask you to do something that I know you won't like." but I am asking you to do it, and please don't give me any grief about it." She looked at me for a couple of seconds and then nodded for me to go on, saying, "Okay, I'll do it. Tell me what you want and why." Just like that? Just like that. Abby reached across the table and took my hand. "I know you'd never do anything to hurt me, so yeah, just like that. What's going on?" "You know, I've been looking into Jonathan Robinson." I waited for her nod and continued. "Last night 2 men pulled guns on me and tried to make me get into their car. Said their boss wanted to see me. They said if I didn't do it, they'd grab you to make me do what they wanted." "What happened to them?" Abby asked with a grim smile. "I know you don't take well to being threatened or being told what to do, and I would bet you went absolutely ballistic when they threatened me. They're in the hospital. At least I think they made it to the hospital. I did get them medical help. I took a drink of coffee. Anyway, I think their boss told them to say that, and my CI says this is a serious guy. So I'd like for you to go visit your folks for a while until this thing is over." Her parents lived in the small south-central town of Eminence, Missouri. It was a small farming community that had developed a tourist economy because of the Jack's Fork River that flowed past the southern portion of the town. The area was in the heart of the Ozarks with tree-covered hills and clear spring-fed streams. Abby started to argue, but I interrupted her. "You've got vacation time coming from work. You even threatened to take it when you got back from this last trip. Your folks would love to see you. You've always loved that country life, and you deserve a break." I took her hand. "But mostly, I won't worry about you if you're with your dad." I waited, and after several seconds, that seemed like minutes, Abby leaned across the table and kissed me. "Let me get packed and I'll leave this morning," she said. After throwing a suitcase into her car, Abby waved as she started her 3-hour drive to her parents' house. Returning to my office, I called Frank Wentz. This time he sounded wide awake. "You get tired of disturbing my sleep, Matt? Thought I'd give you a break, Frank. Listen, I got some info you ought to know about. I don't think you can do anything, but I wanted you to know where I am coming from." Frank lost the joking tone and said, "Tell me what you got. Some of this you already know, some is new to you. You know I followed Mrs. Robinson at the request of her husband. She met George Hamilton for lunch and a dinner or two. Nothing sexual, but she was meeting the guy just the same. I told her husband, and over the next few weeks they seemed to have worked it out. And then what, Matt? Hamilton died in a boating accident, and a few weeks later Mrs. Robinson was killed." "Yeah, you called me about that," Frank replied. "I told you then something didn't add up, and I was right. A friend of mine found out that Cynthia had all the money and she was planning on divorcing Robinson. He would have become a poor man if the divorce went through. I started asking questions through another of my CIs, and he told me a guy named Wiley Thornton was bragging around town that he did the hit on Hamilton and Cynthia. One of those two from last night said Thornton ordered them to come get me and take me to Thornton. As you know, I decided not to go with them." "How much more do you know, Matt?" "I know who Thornton's boss is, and I think I know where I can find Thornton." "Let us handle it," Frank said. His tone was almost an order. "You guys can't do it, Frank. You can't go where I am going and do any good. So I am going to talk to Thornton and get him to admit who his boss is. And then I'll play it by ear." But that a whole Thornton threatened Abby, and nobody does that. "If he and his boss go easy, I'll call you in. What if they don't do it easy?" "That's the question, isn't it, Frank? I'll call you as soon as I can." Matt, I hung up without answering him. Abriana's Deli is a sandwich and coffee shop on the corner of Shaw Avenue in the frontage road beside the Kings Highway overpass in the heart of the historic Italian neighborhood called The Hill. In the days before political correctness, the area was known as Dago Hill. The deli is on the same block as Ragazzi's, so I knew it well. Abriana's is notable for 2 reasons. Its sandwiches and thick dark Italian coffee are the best in St. Louis. The other reason, although not known by the general public, is that Abriana's is the working office of Vito Cilliere. Vito is the head of the mob or crime boss of St. Louis. He is a study in contrasts. Vito runs an organization that is involved in most of the criminal activities of the city. Gambling, loan sharking, and some labor unions are aspects of his empire. About the only thing he doesn't have a hand in is the drug trade. Vito has always felt that drugs were a plague on the people and children of his neighborhood. People are going to gamble, people are going to overextend themselves and need help, and the workers need to be protected from the rich business owners, Vito explained his operations. "I might as well benefit from their wants and needs." The contrasting Vito is one that will do almost anything to help his people of the Hill. He made weekly donations to St. Ambrose Church and special gifts to the building fund. If a widow needed help, Vito would help. If a wife needed financial help for her children because her husband drank or gambled away his paycheck, Vito would give the lady money and have a word with her man. The husband would quickly see the error of his ways after a talk with one of Vito's men. I thought of everything I knew about Vito Cillier as I walked into Abriana's. It was early evening, but he was already holding court at a large wooden table in the back corner of the deli, and I made my way toward him. Vito had 2 of his men sitting with him. Those guys aren't as big as a bus, I thought. More like dump trucks. There was one other man sitting at a nearby table only a few steps from Vito. That man was Rudy Cassidy. Vito wasn't totally old school. He hired whoever could and would do the job he needed if they were Italian or not. Rudy was just such a man. Vito needed someone he trusted to watch his back, so he hired the nephew of a lifelong friend, and Rudy was more than just a bodyguard. He was known as a shooter, and his duties were just what his title meant. Rudy looked like he was sleepy. He was sitting slumped down in his chair, but his eyes moved back and forth and missed nothing. Rudy and I had crossed paths when I was investigating his boss a few years previously. We had danced around each other without really coming to a confrontation. We treated each other with respect, one professional to another. I nodded at Rudy and stepped in front of Vito. "I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Cillier, if you have the time," I said in a respectful manner. I wasn't afraid of Vito, but there was no need to poke a bear in his den. He looked at me for several seconds, and I thought he was going to tell one of the trucks to throw me out. Instead, he pointed at the chair across from him. "I haven't seen you since you tried to hang that gambling rap on me a few years ago. What do you want, Steele?" "As I remember, we couldn't get the evidence to arrest you. You were too smart for us," I said with a smile. "Some would have manufactured evidence just to put me away," Vito replied. I could have, but I wanted to arrest you according to my rules, and I wanted your arrest to stick. If I'd done anything else, you might have walked." The smile went away as I said, "I want to talk to a guy that hangs out at the Hard Case Tavern. So why come to me?" I grinned at Vito. "Come on, Mr. Cillier. Every cop in town knows you run most of the places on the south side, and the Hard Case is one of them. If you don't own it, you have controlling interest in the place. I don't want any trouble with you or your men." I nodded at the 2 trucks and then at Rudy. "This guy has been bragging to your manager, Sammy Hands, about a job he did. He's trying to impress Sammy and go to work for you." "Who is this jamoke?" The term jamoke was an insult, meaning idiot or fool. Vito was old school enough to believe you didn't talk about your work outside of the family. "Guy named Wiley Thornton. I know he's never worked for you, but the only place I can get to him is at the Hard Case." "What's your interest in this, Thornton?" "A man hired me to get some information, and because of it he hired Thornton to get rid of 2 people. I want Thornton, and I want his boss." Vito stared at me for what seemed like a long time and then nodded. "Steele, you were always straight up with me and always treated me with respect, even when you were trying to nail me. Go ahead and talk to Thornton. I'll call Sammy and tell him as long as you don't bother one of ours and it doesn't interfere with our business to stay out of it." I stood, nodded my thanks, turned to leave, but Rudy stepped in my way. "If you need some help, Steele, give me a call. I don't like nobody trying to take my job," he said with a grim smile. Shaking my head, I answered, "Thanks, Rudy, but I got this." I continued out to my truck thinking that I really wouldn't want Vito and Rudy mad at me. "How are you? When can I come home?" Abby asked. Her voice sounded both anguished and hopeful. It was only 8 p.m. after leaving Abriana's and my meeting with Vito, so I'd called Abby at her folks. "I am fine, honey. As to coming home, I think another 3 or 4 days should do it. Once it's over, I'll catch a bus to your parents, and we'll spend a few days boating on Jack's Fork, exploring the area and maybe go fishing." "I'd like that, but why don't you come now and let Detective Wins and the police handle those men? Frank doesn't have anything to go on. Those 2 that jumped me aren't gonna roll over on their boss, cause all they're facing is assault charges. If they were charged as accomplices to the killing of Cynthia or Hamilton, he might have leverage to get them to talk." "But," Abby started to say, and I cut her off. "I'll call Frank and tell him most of what I know and what I am going to do. If he can come up with something, I'll follow his lead." I paused and added, "I'll be careful, girl, I promise." The rest of the call, we talked about the things we'd do when I came down to join her. At 9, I called Frank. "Wins," he answered. "Did I wake you up? If I didn't, I could call you back later." "Some people have crosses to bear," he replied. "I guess you're mine, although I don't know what sin I committed to be saddled with you." He chuckled at his own wit. "What do you need, Matt?" "I'd like to talk to Jasper." "You mean the guy that tried to kidnap you?" "They are refusing to talk. Said they'd take their chances in court." "Why do you want to talk to them?" "Just go with me, Frank. I am gonna make you a case on a double murder." "You mean that Hamilton, Mrs. Robinson case you've been harping about? When are you gonna give up on that?" "Frank, I told you before there's something off-kilter about Mrs. Robinson's murder, and it makes me think Hamilton was a hit as well." There was silence on the line for almost 10 seconds before Frank replied, "Okay, tomorrow, 9 a.m., holdover cells for the 16th precinct. And Matt, you better be damn sure of yourself cause the boss ain't gonna like you hot dogging around. Why should we help you? Jasper asked. Yeah, why? Boyd parroted. Shut up, Boyd, Jasper ordered and turned back to me. Why should we help you, Steele? You're the reason we're in here. Here was what was considered a prison ward at St. Alexius Hospital, which was near Precinct 16 in South St. Louis. There were 3 hospitals, St. Alexius, Barnes Jewish, and Christian, that had a prison ward of some type. The nurse had just left after warning us not to upset her patients. Jasper and Boyd had been brought to St. Alexius after the paramedics treated them because it is the closest to where I had shot the 2 would-be kidnappers. I just asked the 2 men to testify against their boss, Wiley Thornton. Jasper's face showed he'd just come up with an idea. Can you get us out of this? This being the charges that were going to be brought against him and Boyd. No, can't do that, I answered and shook my head. From what I hear, you 2 are going to be charged with assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and attempted murder. That's too many serious charges for the police to let you guys slide. Then why should we help you? Jasper repeated. What I can do is see that you're protected a bit while you're in prison, or as protected as you can be. You know Vito Sillier? I didn't wait for him to answer. Well, he's not happy about Thornton, and if you help put him away, I am pretty sure Mr. Sillier will put the word out that you have his protection. That would give you a lot of clout in prison, and most will leave you alone. If you don't help me, you'll just be fresh meat for the animals to fight over. Works for me, Boyd said, not waiting for Jasper's answer. What do you want us to do? Tell the DA what Thornton said about Robinson when he ordered you to come get me. That's all? I nodded and added, just tell what he said. Don't embellish it. Embellish? It means don't make anything up. Just tell the truth. If you guys do that, I'll have a word with the DA. Maybe he'll reduce the charges because of your help. I'll also have a word with Mr. Sillier, and that will definitely make your life easier in the joint. I called Frank into the hospital room. These boys have decided it was their civic duty to cooperate, so they got something to say. Take their statements and get hold of the DA. I looked at Jasper and Boyd. Make sure and tell him these guys are trying to do what's right. Frank took out his cell phone and started making calls. I left the room, walked down the hall and outside. As I drove away in my truck, I saw Frank waving at me before I left the parking lot. He walked very quickly to where I'd stopped. He leaned on my door and said, those 2 implicated Wiley Thornton, both for ordering the kidnapping and for the Cynthia Robinson murder. Hell, they even said Thornton was involved in Hamilton's death. How did you get those guys to belly up? He asked. I simply told them that Rudy Cassidy was a mite upset with them. I told them Mr. Sillier would help them when they went to prison, that I would get him to put them under his protection. You think he will? I mean, he doesn't know these guys. Vito doesn't know these guys, but he does know and respect Rudy and doesn't want him to get in trouble over the likes of Thornton. I think he'll convince Rudy to back off so I can get to Thornton. In addition, Mr. Sillier is not happy that Thornton is bragging that he's gonna work for Vito. So yeah, I believe Vito will do what I ask. Not for those 2, but to keep Rudy out of trouble they don't need. Frank looked away for a few seconds. You know I have to arrest Thornton, and you can't be involved. I know that as a cop you have to try, but you can't get into the place where he hangs out without warning him. People there know you are a cop and Thornton will go underground. I paused and stared at Frank for a short time. Let me go in alone. You and the boys wait outside. I'll call you when I know he's there. I understand, but why do you want to brace him yourself? Frank looked puzzled and worried. You're not thinking of vigilante justice, are you? Shaking my head in answer, I replied, Thornton can implicate the man that hired him, Robinson. That's the one I want. I doubt we can get Thornton convicted just because of Jasper and Boyd, Frank offered. A good defense attorney could make an argument that their testimony of what they were told is hearsay. At best, the case is circumstantial. Maybe, but I might get Thornton to think we have the evidence to put him away, maybe for the death penalty. Putting the truck into gear, I waved and said, I'll call you when I find him. I drove to my place. It would be several hours before I looked up Thornton. The Hardcase Tavern is a large shotgun-type space, in that it is narrow and long. No more than 30 feet wide, it ran 70 feet to the back wall. There were small 2-person type tables along one wall, and across a 6-foot wide aisle was an open front bar topped with stools for the customers that ran almost the whole length of the room. At the far end of the room was a wide space that had 5 or so larger tables. I'd called Frank at 8 p.m., and he and 3 patrolmen were waiting for me in front of the building. At my suggestion, Frank was dressed differently than when he worked. A nice sports coat, a pinstriped shirt and dress jeans made him look like a regular guy out to have a drink. I motioned for him to come with me since he didn't look like a cop, and that the 3 patrolmen should wait outside. Entering the hard case, I knew for 2 reasons that the big man at the end of the bar was Wiley Thornton. For one, he matched the description that Jasper and Boyd gave me. And the other reason was he was bending the ear of Sammy Hands, the manager of the tavern. Sammy works for Mr. Cillier, and Wiley was trying to make a point as to why Vito should hire him. I pointed Wiley out to Frank, and we walked to the end of the bar where Wiley and Sammy were standing. "Let me buy you a drink, Wiley," I offered. I motioned to the bartender. "I know you?" Wiley asked. He sort of puffed up like he was trying to impress or intimidate me. "Not yet, but you will." The bartender sat Wiley's new drink down. I stuck my fingers down inside his old glass, pulled it toward me, emptied the ice and remains of the drink into the sink behind the bar, and stuck the glass into a clear plastic evidence envelope like the ones the police use. I handed the bag to Frank. He signed and noted the time and date on the back. "Hi, Sammy. I am Matt Steele. Give us a little room, please. Mr. Cillier called and said you would be coming in." Then Sammy turned, walked to the end of the room, and went into a door with the word office on it. "You're not very smart, Wiley. I mean, bragging about how you can make hits on people and other illegal things. Not very smart when you don't know who might be listening." "So what if I talk?" Wiley said and took a sip of his new drink. "Can't be arrested for talking." "Not necessarily so, big guy," I answered. "Jasper and Boyd aren't happy you let them rot in jail, so they rolled over on you. Told us about Robinson and the jobs you did for him. Big deal. It's their word against mine. A good lawyer will get the case dropped." Wiley stood and said, "I am done talking to you, punk. Now get out of my way." He stood and walked toward me, and when I wouldn't move, he took a big roundhouse swing at my head. One rule of bar fights, or any other fights for that matter, is you don't leave yourself open for a counterattack. I stepped inside Wiley's wide punch and put a short right hand deep into the V under his ribs where the sternum ends. A sharp blow to the solar plexus will disable even the largest tough guy. My well-placed fist drove the air out of Wiley's lungs and paralyzed his diaphragm for a few seconds. Wiley bent over, trying to catch his breath. Just the result I had intended. I slid my jacket aside, let my Glock show, and put my hand on the butt of the gun. "Hey, Wiley, I've heard all about how crazy you are. Well, I am a little crazy too. We're just having a good talk here," I continued. "Why don't you stay for a while?" Wiley looked at my pistol from his bent-over position and then into my eyes. He climbed back on his stool. Beside me, Frank grunted to show he wasn't happy about me showing the gun. "It's more than your word against Jasper and Boyd's. You see, there were fingerprints at the Hamilton fire and on the console of Cynthia Robinson's car. The prints weren't in the system, but..." I pointed at the evidence bag. "I bet the prints on that glass will match up. Then we got you, Wiley." Turning a little, without taking my eyes off Wiley, I said, "This is Detective Wins of the St. Louis Police. He's here, among other things, to maintain the chain of evidence on your fingerprints." "You can't take my fingerprints unless you arrest and charge me," Wiley protested. "You got nothing to charge me with." "So wrong, my large friend. That glass is public property after you pushed it aside, so we can use it. Plus your boys dropping a dime on you gives Detective Wins here enough reason to take you in for questioning." Wiley glanced at Frank. "So go ahead and take me in." "Okay," Frank said, stood up and pulled out his handcuffs. He put them on Wiley and said, "Wiley Thornton, you are wanted for questioning concerning the murders of George Hamilton and Cynthia Robinson. You have the right to an attorney," and finished reading Wiley his rights. "Now, Wiley, we have a deal for you," I said. "Between your boys rolling over on you and these fingerprints," I pointed to Wiley's glass, "you're going to pay for killing Hamilton and Cynthia Robinson. How bad you pay is up to you." "What do you mean, how bad?" Wiley said. He wasn't as arrogant and fearless as he had been. "Testify that Robinson hired you and paid you to kill Hamilton and his wife. Detective Wins, and I will tell the DA how you cooperated and get you a deal." "What kind of deal?" "You're going down, Wiley. I am pretty sure the detective and I can get the DA to take the death penalty off the table. You'll still go to jail for a long time, but at least you'll be alive." I looked at Wiley. "What do you say, Wiley?" Now it was Wiley's turn to stare at Frank and me. After a few seconds, that seemed much longer, he answered me, "I think I'll wait and talk to my lawyer." Frank nodded and used his radio to call the patrolman waiting outside to come in. We watched as the cops lead the suspect out to a patrol car. They would take Wiley to central booking at police headquarters downtown on 9th Street. Frank would have to go to headquarters and do the paperwork on the arrest. He poked me when we got to his car. "You realize that as soon as Thornton meets with his attorney, the attorney will demand the report on the fingerprints," Frank said in an exasperated voice. "And we won't have anything to give him." Thornton will walk, and I'll be lucky not to be walking a beat again. Matt, I am too old to go back to foot patrol. Not true, I replied, shaking my head. I checked with an attorney friend of mine who works for Markham and Sylvester. You mean that damn high-priced criminal defense firm? I nodded and continued. My buddy, he wants to stay anonymous, said that we have to charge Thornton and then the DA has to get the grand jury to indict him and a prosecutor assigned before we have to hand over the evidence. Don't charge him. Just hold him for questioning for 48 hours. What good would that do? I can't manufacture evidence, and all we have is Jasper and Boyd's statement. You interrogate Thornton, with his attorney present, but follow my lead, I answered and grinned. We'll get him, Frank. I am sure of it. Frank set a large digital tape recorder on the table and turned it on. We were in an interview room at the police central booking building. In the days before political correctness, it was an interrogation room. For the record, I am Detective Frank Wins of the St. Louis Police and will be recording this interview. Also present are the suspect Wiley Thornton. Frank pointed at Wiley's attorney and said, Please identify yourself for the record, counselor. Attorney Philip Stone, Public Defender's Office, representing Mr. Thornton. Frank said, Thank you, Mr. Stone. Looking at me, he added, Also in attendance is Matt Steele, a consultant on this case for the St. Louis Police Department. Mr. Thornton, you are a suspect in the murders of a Mr. George Hamilton and Mrs. Cynthia Robinson. Do you have anything you would like to say at this time? Before Stone could respond, Wiley said, Prove it. He sat back in his chair and put his shackled hands on the table in front of him. He looked unafraid and pleased with himself. Frank's cell phone beeped at him, letting him know he had a text message. He punched a button, looked at the message, and stood up. Excuse me, Frank said and stood up. Holding up his phone, he said, This is something I have to attend to. I'll be right back. He reached over, turned off the recorder, and left the room. Now it was my turn to put the pressure on Wiley. We've got you 7 ways from Sunday, Wiley, I told him. When the results of the fingerprint test come back, you'll be placed at the scene of both murders. I looked from Wiley to his attorney and back. Unless, of course, you are innocent, I offered. And we both know that ain't so. We will, of course, expect you to turn over any exculpatory evidence that you have. Stone interrupted me before I could continue. In fact, I would like to see that evidence before you continue to talk with my client. He sat back. Now he was the one that looked very pleased with himself. I am not an attorney, I replied. But I believe that since Mr. Thornton hasn't been charged or indicted, that the state isn't required to give you investigative results. He hasn't been charged? Then why is he in jail? We brought Mr. Thornton in for questioning, Frank answered as he re-entered the room with a well-dressed young woman. She was tall, slender, and very pretty. She would have been a huge distraction if the situation wasn't so serious. Frank pushed a button and turned the recorder back on. Wiley, if you decide to tell the truth, you'll a nice prize. Turning to Frank, I said, Detective Wins, please tell our contestant what he'll win. This is Assistant District Attorney Geraldine Sawyer. He pulled out a chair for the ADA, and she sat down across from Wiley and his attorney. If you give us a statement as to your involvement and the person or persons that hired you, she will personally talk to the DA in your behalf. Frank sighed and added, You're going down, Wiley. You might as well make it as easy on yourself as you can. Stone pulled on Wiley's arm, and they put their heads together to talk. After several minutes, Stone looked at Sawyer and Frank. You have to take the death penalty out of the equation. Then my client will make a statement. ADA Sawyer waited for about 15 seconds before she responded. I'm sure it seemed longer to Wiley. If Mr. Thornton will be truthful and forthcoming, the DA's office will not be seeking the death penalty. Stone whispered something to Wiley and turned back to Sawyer. However, Sawyer continued, a life sentence or life with the possibility of parole after 25 years is very probable and acceptable. I looked at ADA Sawyer, trying to catch her eye. Geraldine, Jerry, and I had worked together several times while I was still a detective first class for the St. Louis Police. We were friends, and that is why I'd asked her to participate in our little play. Her statement was a little less than I'd hoped for. I'd wanted her to apply the screws to Wiley. I guess she had rules and such that she had to follow, and so far she hadn't stepped over the line. We hadn't officially told Jerry about the little escapade with Thornton's drink glass, so technically we hadn't stepped over the line either. I didn't have the same rules, and since it was me doing the talking at the bar, Frank had sort of turned his head. Everyone was quiet for a while, and then Frank said, Thornton? Turning back from talking to his lawyer, Thornton said, Okay, what do you want to know? Did you murder George Hamilton and Cynthia Robinson? Jerry asked. And if so, why? Getting a nod from his attorney, Wiley answered, Yeah, I did them too. The broad's husband. At a look from Jerry, he said, a guy named Robinson, hired me to put them down. He paid me 100 GS to do it. Would that be Jonathan Robinson, Cynthia Robinson's husband? Jerry prompted. Wiley nodded. A verbal answer is necessary, Mr. Thornton. Yeah, that's the guy. Did he say why he wanted them dead? At first, Wiley shook his head, saw the look on Jerry's face, remember her instructions and answered, nah, he just said to do them both. First Hamilton and a few weeks later the wife. How did you murder them? That Hamilton guy had a boat. He kept up on Alton Lake. I disconnected the air pump that keeps the, what do you call it? Oh yeah, the bilge free of gas fumes. Then I scraped the insulation off the starter wires, and when he turned the key it caused a spark. That ignited the gas fumes, and the boat blew up and burned. The guy was sitting behind the wheel when it went off. I watched from up on the high dirt berm above the marina. You know, in case it didn't work I could go down and finish the job. What about Cynthia Robinson? I carjacked her coming out of one of those fancy stores out in Frontenac. Her arms were full of packages, and she was having a problem getting them into the car. I snuck up behind her and smacked the hell out of her. Mrs. Robinson was severely beaten, Frank put in. The bitch didn't go down the first time I hit her, and it made me mad. Anyway, after I knocked her out, I threw her into the passenger side and drove down under the Eads Bridge. Then I shot her. Where did you shoot her, and what type of gun did you use? Jerry was going to get all the information, so there would be no way Wiley could slip out of the deal. Used a silenced .22 and shot her in the back of the head. I was upset that two innocent people, who I sort of knew, had been killed because of information I'd given to Robinson and killed so viciously. What bothered me more was Wiley's total lack of shame and the dispassionate way he told what he had done. In fact, he seemed almost proud of his actions. Jerry looked at Frank and then at me to see if we had any more questions. We shook our heads. Turning back to Wiley, she said, Mr. Thornton, the DA's office will honor the agreement we made due to the facts you've given us tonight and because of your agreed forthcoming testimony in court. Wiley smiled and leaned back in his chair. But, Jerry continued, I am going to do my best to see that you go to a particularly tough prison, like the Jefferson City Correctional Center, also known as Boonville. Boonville is as bad as Attica or Alcatraz ever were in their day. Isn't it, Assistant District Attorney Sawyer? I asked. The Correctional Center is considered to be one of the worst prisons west of the Mississippi, Jerry answered. I mean, as far as prisoner safety. I turned and smiled at Thornton. Hope you enjoy your new home, Wiley. I am sure the guys there will welcome you with open arms. I mean, a nice-looking, fresh young man like yourself and all. Frank rose and walked around the table to stand beside Wiley. Stand up, he ordered. When Wiley was on his feet, Frank continued. Wiley Thornton, you are under arrest for the murders of George Hamilton and Cynthia Robinson. He pulled a laminated card out of a compartment in his police ID leather folder. Frank read Wiley his Miranda rights for a second time. You should have read my client his rights before questioning, Stone protested. He was just being questioned now. He's under arrest. Frank gave Stone and Wiley an evil grin. And I did read him his rights when I brought him in for questioning. Besides, you were with him during the questioning, so his attorney was already present. So we're good. Walking to the door, Frank opened it and called out to one of the jailhouse police. Put this piece of garbage in a cell until he's arraigned. A cell, not the holding tank. The cop grabbed Wiley's arm and marched him deeper into the building. Stone left to make arrangements to talk with his client some more. I hope this holds up, I said. I want Wiley to pay for this, but I want Robinson more. I don't know anything about your actions at the Hardcase Tavern. Jerry looked at me and smiled. But this was legal, she reassured me. And if we push hard, Stone will go along. Next time, call me for an easy one, guys. See ya. She left the room to go prepare her case. That young lady is as hard as nails, I said. Geraldine Sawyer wants to be our next DA, Frank replied. And I wouldn't bet against her. Frank and I left the central booking complex and got to where his police car was parked illegally in a loading zone. Should you be parked here in a loading zone? I asked and grinned. I was unloading a case for a killer. Besides, who is gonna give what is obviously an unmarked police car a ticket? He smiled back at me. Men and women in the traffic division aren't stupid. The car could belong to one of the brass, and that's a load of crap the patrolmen don't need. When are you going to get Robinson? I'd like to go with you. I have a vested interest in this. Frank hesitated for a bit, and I waited hopefully. Well, partner, Frank answered in a bad John Wayne imitation. I reckon we could go to his office and corral him right now. Guess it wouldn't hurt if y'all moseyed along with the posse. Frank changed his voice back to normal and added, I thought I'd arrest him in front of the people who work or do business with him. Sorta in front of God and everybody. I went to the passenger door of Frank's car, opened it and said, I like your style, cowboy. Let's hit the trail. We're burning daylight. Your imitation is worse than mine. Get in the car. Called a mutual friend early this morning, Frank said. He gave me some interesting information. What mutual friend? Ricky Willard. Frank sounded a little angry. Oh, Ricky, I answered brilliantly. I didn't like Frank's tone because I didn't want Ricky to get into trouble for helping me. You remember Ricky, don't you? Frank continued in a sarcastic voice. The guy who is a consultant for cybercrimes for the St. Louis Police Department, not for Matt Steele investigations. The same one that gave you information on the Robinsons. Come on, Frank. Ricky just did me a favor. Hell, it took him less than an hour. I'll pay the damn department for his time. Shut up, you piece of shit. Frank paused and added, you can't use police resources to help with your business, Matt. Understand? I didn't answer or reply. You're not gonna listen to me, are you? The only resources I use are friends and colleagues, like you and Ricky. I don't ask you guys to do anything illegal, and in Ricky's case, he said he did the work on his lunch break. I smiled at Frank for the first time since we'd gotten into the car. What did you find out? For a minute, I thought my friend was going to ignore me. He stared straight ahead and then took a deep breath and let it out. I had Ricky look into Robinson's financials. That's all he did for me, I offered. Cynthia had all the money. Frank nodded. Yeah, but that check didn't show a withdrawal Robinson made just after Hamilton's boat blew up with him in it. There was another withdrawal of the same amount after Cynthia Robinson was killed. He glanced over at me to make sure he had my attention. Each withdrawal was for $50,000. In case you can't add, that's a total of $100,000, the same amount Thornton said he was paid. Frank smiled. Along with Thornton's testimony that should tie up Mr. Jonathan Robinson. How are we going to do this? We aren't going to do anything, Frank answered. In my capacity as a detective for the St. Louis Police, I will arrest Robinson. I got a warrant while you were talking to ADA Sawyer. That's why I left the room for a few minutes. You can come along, but understand, Matt, it is only as a favor from me. Don't screw it up. You know, I told Robinson just after his wife was killed that I was gonna make sure he answered for Cynthia and Hamilton. I smiled at Frank and asked, can I at least tell him I told you so? Frank shook his head, smiled, and kept driving. That girl gets prettier every time I see her. I thought as Frank and I entered Robinson's outer office. Hello, Mr. Steele. Nice to see you again, the efficient young woman said. Mr. Robinson is in a meeting. Please have a seat. He shouldn't be too long. Frank stepped up to her desk and showed her his detective badge and ID. I don't think we'll wait, miss. He turned and I followed him through the thick carved wooden door into the main office. I saw the secretary reach for her phone, but I held up a finger and shook my head. She replaced the receiver onto its base. Jonathan Robinson and 3 other men were sitting at a conference table placed in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows in the northeast corner of the huge office. There was a 4th, younger, man with a very large computer monitor mounted on a sort of cart standing between the table and the windows. He was giving some type of presentation because there were graphs and pie charts showing on the screen. How anyone can pay attention to a computer monitor with that view of the Mississippi River is beyond me, I thought. Frank stepped toward the table with me, following in his wake. He held up his ID when he got to Robinson, who had stood as Frank and I walked in. Jonathan Robinson, you are under arrest, Frank said. What is the charge? Robinson asked. His voice showed more anger that someone would disrupt his oh-so-important meeting than fear. We'll start with premeditation to commit murder, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, both before and after the fact, and conspiracy to commit a felonious act. That will do for a start. Frank again took a laminated card out of his ID folder and started to read Robinson his rights. Robinson made a break as soon as Frank looked down at the card. He got past Frank and headed toward the door at a run. Unfortunately for Robinson, he had to get past me as well. He didn't make it. I snapped a straight left hand into his jaw. He took a step backward and fell onto the seat of his pants. Moving until I was standing over Robinson, the first said, I told you I'd see you got what is coming to you, Jonathan. The name Jonathan was said with sarcasm. The fact that I just reminded you doesn't seem to be enough, but it will have to do. Frank rolled Robinson over onto his stomach and none too gently handcuffed him. Guess we'll have to add fleeing from an officer and obstruction of justice to the charges. He pulled and helped his prisoner to his feet. Did I get involved too much? I asked with an innocent look. Shut up, Frank replied with fake anger. Let's get Mr. Robinson to his new home. I think we should sand and refinish the wainscoting, I told Abby. I've never understood why people would want to paint over outstanding wood like this. We were working on the renovation of the huge old house in Compton Heights that I'd bought for us. We decided to restore the place to its former glory while updating things like the plumbing, wiring, and windows plus the heating and cooling systems. The large floor-to-ceiling windows were open to let in the soft summer breeze. This helped get rid of the paint smell from the other rooms. Before she could answer, my cell phone gave out its loud, annoying ring. "Matt Steele," I answered in a less than friendly voice. "I hate that damn phone. It's a necessity, but I still hate it. It's Frank, Matt. Thought I'd let you know that the DA threw the book at Robinson. Wouldn't let him plea bargain down to lesser charges. Told Robinson he was going to pay fully for his crimes." Frank chuckled and added, "The DA said he was going to prosecute the case himself. After all, it is an election year." It had been better than 3 months since Frank Wins had arrested Jonathan Robinson. "Good to hear, buddy. Let me know when the trial will start. I'd like to see his face when the charges are read to him, and I'd like to see his face when he hears the guilty verdict. By the by, if you and the missus would like to join Abby and me, we are going to Ragazzi's about 7. "Robinson?" Abby asked as I hung up. I nodded. "Good. Now you can get your mind back on our house." "Our house, is it?" I asked in a serious voice with a serious look on my face. Abby looked hard at me, not knowing if I was kidding or not. I walked over to my jacket lying on the old dining room table and took a sheaf of papers out of the inside pocket. Handing her the papers, I waited for her to read the top one. After a few seconds, she looked at me again, but this time with a little smile. "That's the new deed, and as you can see, it lists the owners as Matthew and Abigail Steele," I told her. "To make it legal, I suppose we should get married." I watched as her smile got bigger and put an engagement ring on her finger. "And by the way, I love you." Abby looked at the ring, then slipped it up and down on her finger. Holding it up to the light, she said, "I've always wanted to be a property owner." Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.